Michael Jordan learns his favorite childhood coach has cancer, then flies to be with him. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Michael Jordan's life had been defined by greatness from an early age. He had grown up in Wilmington, North Carolina, surrounded by a loving family, but it was the game of basketball that had truly shaped him. From the first time he picked up a ball, Michael was driven by a hunger for success. But it wasn't just the game itself that fueled his ambition, it was the people around him, particularly one man who would leave an indelible mark on his life, Coach Ray Adams. Coach Adams had been Michael's first basketball coach. He wasn't like the others. While many coaches focused on skills and drills, Coach Adams cared about building character. He wasn't just teaching the game, he was teaching Michael how to be a man. His methods were tough but fair. He pushed Michael harder than anyone else, demanding more from him, and in return, Michael gave everything he had. Coach Adams wasn't just the guy who taught Michael how to handle a basketball, he was the one who taught him how to handle life's challenges. Years had passed since Michael had left Wilmington. He had gone on to become a global icon, his name synonymous with basketball greatness. The 6 NBA championships, the MVPs, and the countless accolades were all part of Michael's journey. But in all his success, there was one constant that stayed with him, Coach Adams. As Michael climbed the ranks of professional basketball, he often thought back to his childhood. The memories of long afternoons spent in the gym, running drills and listening to Coach Adams' lessons, were always with him. The values instilled in him by Coach, hard work, resilience, humility, had become the foundation of his entire career. But life, as it often does, threw him a curveball. It was a typical morning when Michael's phone rang. The call was from his brother Larry, who lived in Wilmington. He had some difficult news. "Mike, it's Coach Adams," Larry said, his voice heavy. "He's been diagnosed with cancer. They say it's pretty serious." Michael sat there in stunned silence. He could hear his brother's words, but it didn't feel real. Coach Adams, the man who had been so strong and full of life, was fighting for his own. The news hit Michael harder than he expected. He had known Coach Adams for so many years, but this felt different. This wasn't just a coach who had helped him build his career, this was someone who had shaped him into the man he had become. Larry's voice brought him back to the present. "He's in a hospital in Wilmington, Mike. I think you should come down here. He's not doing well." Michael's heart sank. The world around him seemed to fade away as he processed the reality of the situation. He had built a life for himself in a world where everything was fast-paced, where people came and went, but Coach Adams had always been a constant. The idea of him being in a hospital, fighting for his life, was something Michael couldn't quite grasp. Without a word, Michael stood up and began to pace his home. His mind was racing, but there was only one thing that felt right in that moment: he had to be there. He had to be with Coach Adams. No phone call, no public gesture, no message could replace the simple act of showing up. Within minutes, Michael had packed a bag and was making arrangements to fly to Wilmington. There was no time to waste. His mind wasn't focused on basketball or his upcoming games, it was on the man who had taught him so much about life, the man who had shaped his childhood and, in many ways, shaped his future. The flight was quiet. Michael sat in his seat, staring out the window, reflecting on the years that had passed since he'd seen Coach Adams. He thought about all the lessons, the moments in practice when Coach had pushed him to be better, to work harder, to never give up. He thought about the quiet talks after games, when Coach had spoken to him not just as a player but as a person, teaching him the importance of humility, of integrity, and of doing things the right way. Michael had never been one to show emotion publicly, but now, as he sat on the plane, the reality of what was happening hit him with full force. The man who had been there when he was just a kid, when his dreams were still distant and unformed, was now fighting for his life. The thought of losing him was overwhelming. When Michael landed in Wilmington, he didn't go straight to the hospital. Instead, he drove through the streets of his hometown, taking in the familiar sights. The town had changed in some ways, but it still held the same charm it had when he was a boy. The basketball courts were still there, the same parks where he and his friends had played countless games. It all felt like a distant memory, and yet, it felt like everything was connected. He drove to the gym where Coach Adams had first coached him, parked, and stepped out of the car. The sound of basketballs bouncing echoed through the open doors. Michael walked inside, taking a deep breath, his eyes scanning the familiar court. He could almost hear Coach's voice, barking instructions during practice, pushing him to be better. The memories flooded back, and for a moment, it felt as though he had never left. After a few moments of reflection, Michael made his way to the hospital. As he walked through the hallways, he felt a sense of urgency but also a deep sense of peace. He wasn't sure what he would say to Coach when he saw him, but he knew that words didn't matter as much as simply being there. Michael had built a career on being the best, on always striving for greatness, but in this moment, it wasn't about that. It was about showing up for someone who had always shown up for him. When Michael entered the room, Coach Adams was lying in a hospital bed, weak but still with that familiar fire in his eyes. His face was pale, and there were tubes and machines surrounding him, but his smile when he saw Michael spoke volumes. It was a smile that said more than words ever could. "Mike," Coach Adams said, his voice raspy but warm. "I knew you'd come." Michael walked over to the bed, pulling a chair close, sitting down beside his old coach. There was nothing grand about the moment, no speeches, no public displays. Just the quiet presence of two men who had shared a history, who had shaped each other's lives in ways they would never fully understand. "Of course, Coach," Michael said quietly. "I wouldn't be who I am without you. I had to be here." Coach Adams reached out and placed his hand on Michael's. "I'm proud of you, son," he said softly. "You've done more than I ever imagined. But what matters most is what you do now. You've always been a leader, Mike. Now, lead with your heart." The words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. They weren't just about basketball, they were about life. Michael had spent so much of his career focused on winning, on being the best, that he had forgotten about the importance of leading with love, with compassion. Sitting beside Coach Adams, he realized that the lessons he had learned all those years ago still held true. It wasn't about what he had accomplished, but about the way he had impacted others. As they sat together in that quiet hospital room, Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude and connection. The man who had first believed in him, who had shaped him into the person he had become, was still teaching him. And in that moment, Michael knew that no matter what happened next, this bond, this legacy, would never fade. Michael sat by Coach Adams' bedside, the room filled with the hum of machines and the soft scent of antiseptic. As the hours ticked by, he found himself lost in thought. The flood of memories, of grueling practices, late-night talks about life, the laughs, and the hard lessons, seemed to be all he could think about. Here he was, a grown man, a global icon, sitting next to the man who had shaped his life and taught him the most important lessons that had carried him through his legendary basketball career. Yet, in this moment, he didn't feel like the champion everyone knew him to be. He felt vulnerable, humbled by the man before him who was now so frail, the ravages of cancer unmistakable in the lines on his face. Coach Adams, despite his sickness, hadn't lost the sharpness of his eyes. Even now, the fire that had made him such an effective teacher still flickered beneath his brow. Michael was glad for that. He didn't know what to say or how to act. What could he possibly say to the man who had been there for him at the beginning, when he was just a kid trying to make his mark on the basketball court? "Mike," Coach Adams' voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "I never thought I'd see the day you'd be here with me like this. Thought you'd be off making history somewhere." Michael smiled faintly, feeling his throat tighten at the words. "I've made history, Coach. But none of it would have happened without you." Coach Adams chuckled weakly, his hand resting on top of Michael's. "Don't give me too much credit, boy. You had it in you all along. I just pointed you in the right direction." Michael nodded, his hand still firmly holding his coach's. It felt comforting to hear those words again. Throughout his career, no matter how much attention he got, how many records he broke, Michael had always been haunted by the idea that perhaps he wasn't good enough, at least not the way his coach had believed in him. Coach Adams had always seen something in him that Michael didn't fully realize was there, pushing him to be better, not just as a player, but as a person. "It's funny," Michael said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes searching for the right words. "I've been through all this, success, fame, the pressure of being the guy for so long. But none of it makes sense without remembering where it all started. You know, I've often thought back to those days at the gym with you. You taught me more than just basketball." Coach Adams nodded slowly, his breathing shallow but steady. "I'm glad to hear that. What I always wanted was for you to be a good man first. The basketball part was easy. It was you who had the heart. You just needed someone to remind you of it sometimes." Michael's throat closed up at the reminder of how much trust Coach had placed in him. When Michael had been just another kid in the gym, uncertain and hungry, Coach Adams had never doubted his potential. The practices, the late nights, the encouragement, those were the moments that had shaped Michael's character. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about learning how to be a leader, to persevere, and to never let the weight of the world break you. In that moment, Michael realized just how much he owed to this man. Not for his jump shot, or his championships, or his place in the history books, but for the ability to overcome adversity and keep pushing, no matter the odds. Coach Adams had been the first person to teach him that lesson. "I've tried to live up to what you taught me, Coach," Michael said quietly, feeling the lump in his throat grow. "I really have." Coach Adams squeezed his hand gently, his grip still firm despite his frail condition. "You've done more than live up to it. You've exceeded everything I ever thought you could do. But remember, it's never about the records or the trophies. It's about the kind of person you are. And Mike, you're a good man." There it was again, the words Michael had longed to hear. Over the years, with all the accolades, he had seldom heard praise that wasn't tied to his basketball accomplishments. He had spent so many years proving himself to the world, constantly chasing after the next victory. But here, in the quiet room, beside the man who had started it all, it wasn't about the next game, the next season, or the next championship. It was about character, about the kind of legacy Michael would leave behind. And Coach Adams had already given him the highest compliment. As Michael sat there, lost in thought, the nurse came in to check on Coach Adams. She was kind but firm, checking his vitals, adjusting the 4-drip, and making sure he was comfortable. Michael watched quietly, giving her space to do her work, but his mind was racing. He wanted to say more to Coach, so much more. The words didn't seem enough for what Coach had meant to him. How could he possibly express the gratitude he felt, the sense of obligation to this man who had done so much for him? Once the nurse had left, Michael leaned forward again, meeting Coach's gaze. "You know," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "there's something I've never told you. Something I've thought about a lot, but never said." Coach Adams tilted his head, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You were my first role model," Michael said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Before anyone else. Before the games, before the fame. You were the one who showed me what it meant to work hard, to lead, to never give up. All the success I've had, it's because of you. Everything I've done, I learned from you." Coach Adams' eyes softened, a small smile forming on his face. "I'm proud of you, Mike. But you did all the hard work. I just gave you the tools. You picked them up and ran with it." Michael sat back in his chair, the weight of the moment settling over him. The bond between him and Coach Adams was something that couldn't be easily explained. It wasn't just a coach-player relationship, it was a mentor-mentee connection that had transcended the basketball court. Coach had been there during Michael's formative years, shaping his approach to life in ways that still resonated with him every day. Even in his final moments, Coach Adams was still teaching him. As the hours passed, Michael stayed by his coach's side, watching over him. The hospital room was quiet, except for the occasional beep of the machines and the soft sound of their breathing. There was no rush. Michael knew that there were no more games to be played, no trophies to be won. This moment, this simple act of showing up and sitting by Coach Adams' side, was the most important thing he could do. Later that evening, Michael took a moment to step outside. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above. He walked around the small hospital grounds, trying to clear his head. He knew that things were changing, that life was finite, and that no matter how much success he had, there were moments like these that truly defined who a person was. Not the championships, not the endorsements, but the connections we make in the people we choose to stand by. The stars above seemed to remind him that the world was vast, and that time was fleeting. Michael's life had been spent chasing greatness, but now, in this moment, he was reminded of the simple truths: love, loyalty, respect. These were the true measures of a life well lived. When he returned to Coach's room, he took a deep breath and sat back down beside him. The night felt heavy, but it was also peaceful. Michael knew that he would do anything to make sure Coach Adams knew how much he meant to him. This wasn't about legacy or fame, it was about being there for the people who shaped your life when they needed you most. And as Michael sat quietly in that hospital room, with his coach by his side, he realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just show up. The next few days seemed to pass in a blur for Michael. He spent every moment he could at the hospital, sitting by Coach Adams' side, talking to him, reminiscing about old times. Every so often, Coach would smile, his eyes lighting up as he recalled a memory from their days together on the court. Michael could see the effort it took for his coach to keep those memories alive, but he knew that even in his weakened state, Coach Adams was still trying to offer the wisdom and encouragement that had defined their relationship for so many years. But as much as Michael tried to keep things light, there were moments when the weight of the situation was undeniable. Coach's health continued to decline. The cancer was progressing, and the doctors had been candid with Michael about the situation. Despite their best efforts, it was clear that Coach Adams didn't have much time left. Michael couldn't reconcile the idea of losing the man who had given him so much, who had shaped him into the player and person he had become. The hospital room became a quiet sanctuary, the hours spent with Coach Adams more meaningful than anything Michael had ever experienced on the basketball court. Here, there was no competition, no rivalry, no pressure to perform. There was just the quiet understanding between two men who had shared so much and yet still had so much more to say. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Coach Adams looked over at Michael, his gaze a little clearer than it had been in days. He had been sleeping for hours, but something in his expression told Michael that he was ready to speak. Michael leaned in closer, knowing that whatever Coach was about to say would be important. "Mike," Coach whispered, his voice raspy but steady. "I'm proud of you." Michael's heart swelled at the words, and a lump formed in his throat. He hadn't expected to hear this now. He had spent so much of his life striving for the kind of praise Coach had always given him, but hearing it in this context, at this moment, felt different, more meaningful than any compliment he had ever received on the court. It wasn't about the game anymore. It was about the impact Michael had made as a person, not just a player. "I've been thinking about all the things we did together," Coach continued, his hand shaking slightly as he reached out to touch Michael's. "The games, the practices, the lessons you taught me along the way. You've become everything I ever hoped you would, and more. You've done great things, Mike. But the best thing about you, what I've always admired most, is the way you've never lost who you are." Michael tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He was overwhelmed by the weight of the moment, the magnitude of everything Coach had just said. He had spent so many years focusing on winning, on being the best, but now, as Coach's words sank in, he realized that what truly mattered wasn't the number of championships or MVPs. It was about staying grounded, about remembering the people and the values that had shaped him long before he had become the icon he was today. "Thank you, Coach," Michael finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me everything I know. Without you, none of this would have been possible." Coach smiled weakly. "You're not done yet, Mike. There's still more for you to give. Don't ever forget that." The conversation left Michael shaken. He had known, of course, that Coach was proud of him, but hearing it so directly, with the end in sight, hit him harder than anything he had ever heard. He had always carried Coach's lessons with him, but now, sitting there, listening to Coach Adams speak with such finality, Michael was reminded of just how much this man had given him, how much he had shaped his life. For the next few days, Michael stayed by Coach's side, refusing to leave. He spent hours reminiscing about the old days, talking about everything from the struggles they had faced on the court to the dreams they had once shared about what the future might hold. In those quiet moments, Michael learned things he hadn't known before. Coach talked about the sacrifices he had made for the game, about the players he had mentored over the years, and the pride he felt in watching them grow. Even in his weakened state, Coach still cared deeply about the game and the people he had touched. But as the days wore on, Michael could feel the inevitable coming. Coach's health was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated, and it became harder for him to stay awake, to hold a conversation. But even in his sleep, there was a sense of peace about him. Michael wasn't sure if it was the comfort of knowing he was there, or the peace that came from living a life well lived, but Coach Adams seemed ready. Ready to let go. One evening, Michael sat beside Coach's bed, holding his hand. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft beeping of the machines. Michael had learned to accept that this moment would come, but he still wasn't ready. It wasn't just the loss of a coach, it was the loss of a mentor, a friend, a second father. "Coach," Michael whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm here. You don't have to fight anymore. It's okay." For a moment, Coach seemed to respond, his eyes fluttering open, his gaze locking with Michael's. He smiled faintly, as if reassuring him that everything would be all right. Then, just as quickly, he closed his eyes again, drifting into a peaceful slumber. Michael sat there for hours, not moving, just holding his coach's hand, not knowing what to do next. The feeling of helplessness was something he hadn't experienced in years. He had always been the one people turned to for answers, for guidance, for strength. But now, in this moment, he was just a man beside the man who had always been there for him, offering all the strength he had left. The morning that followed was quiet. Michael woke to the sound of footsteps outside the room, a nurse checking in. When she entered, she gently placed her hand on Michael's shoulder. She didn't need to say anything, the look in her eyes told him everything. Coach Adams had passed away in the night. For a long time, Michael didn't move. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on the bed, the man who had been his guiding light now gone. He felt a rush of emotions, grief, loss, confusion, and even a sense of gratitude. Coach Adams had been the first person to show him the value of hard work and perseverance. He had shaped Michael's life in ways he would never fully understand, and now, he was gone. But Michael knew something deep down. Coach's legacy would live on through him, through every game he had ever played, through every life he had ever touched. Michael's success wasn't just his own, it was a tribute to Coach Adams, to everything he had instilled in him. As he left the hospital room, Michael took one last look at the small, quiet space that had witnessed so many shared memories. It was time to say goodbye, but Michael knew that he would carry Coach Adams' lessons with him forever. The days after Coach Adams' passing felt surreal for Michael. He had experienced loss before, family members, friends, even the crushing defeats that had come in the final seconds of pivotal games. But nothing had prepared him for the void left by the passing of his childhood mentor. The man who had molded him into the player he became, who had instilled in him values that transcended basketball, was now gone. It left Michael with an overwhelming sense of emptiness, something he couldn't shake, no matter how many victories or accolades he had achieved. The funeral was a quiet affair, with a small gathering of people, friends, family, former players, each of them touched by the life of a man who had given so much to the community. Michael had kept to himself during the ceremony, allowing others to share their stories and memories of Coach Adams. He knew the words being spoken, the anecdotes of Coach's unrelenting drive and love for the game, but to Michael, the stories felt like an echo of the larger truth, that the man who had been there when he was a kid, who had believed in him when no one else did, was now gone. As Michael stood by the graveside, watching the casket being lowered into the ground, he couldn't help but reflect on all the times Coach had been there. He thought back to the long hours spent together in the gym, the tough lessons that had sometimes seemed impossible to understand at the time, but that now held more meaning than ever. Coach had pushed him beyond what he thought were his limits, teaching him not just how to be a better player but how to approach life itself. He had given Michael the foundation for everything he would go on to achieve. And now, standing in front of his grave, Michael realized how much he had taken it all for granted. He had always felt like he was in control of everything, his career, his public image, his legacy. But now, without Coach, he felt lost. There was no playbook for this kind of loss. No championship could fill the space Coach had left. It was a reminder that in all the success, and all the moments of glory, the true lessons in life often came from the people who were by your side, not the victories themselves. The days after the funeral were quiet. Michael spent time with his family, reflecting on the things that mattered most. It wasn't easy to shake the heaviness in his chest. Every game he played, every shot he took, felt different now. The intensity he had once felt during each victory wasn't there. It was as if he had played his entire career with Coach Adams' voice in his ear, guiding him, but now there was only silence. One evening, Michael found himself walking the streets of Wilmington. The town had changed, of course, but it still felt like home. The same familiar sights, the same small-town feel, it all brought him back to the days when life was simpler. He passed by the old gym where he and Coach Adams had spent countless hours. It looked the same on the outside, but he knew that it was no longer just a gym, it was a part of him, a place that had shaped his path in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He stood outside the gym for a long time, staring up at the faded sign. It was as though everything in his life had led him back to this moment, to this place. He couldn't help but feel a rush of gratitude for everything that had come from those early years, for the lessons learned, the hardships overcome, and the bond that had formed between him and Coach Adams. Michael didn't know how to move forward yet, but he knew he needed to. His legacy, his career, all of it had been built on what Coach Adams had taught him. And now, it felt like it was up to him to honor that legacy, not just with the trophies and accolades, but by living the lessons he had learned. He realized that the greatest way he could pay tribute to Coach wasn't through grand gestures, but through continuing to live the way Coach had always taught him to, with integrity, humility, and the relentless drive to be the best version of himself, on and off the court. The following weeks were a time of introspection for Michael. He stayed close to his family, sought solace in the quiet moments, and, when the time felt right, he returned to the court. It wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. He hadn't realized how much he missed the game, how much he missed the sound of the ball bouncing, the rhythm of his body moving across the court. Basketball had always been his sanctuary, and though his heart wasn't fully in it, stepping back onto the court brought him a sense of peace. It was like reconnecting with a part of himself that had been dormant for a while. But even then, there was something different about his approach. He wasn't playing for the championship anymore. He wasn't chasing records or titles. He played because he remembered the joy it had given him, the feeling of pushing himself beyond what he thought he could do. And he played because, in those moments on the court, he could still hear Coach's voice in his head, pushing him, encouraging him, teaching him the lessons he had carried with him all these years. In time, the feeling of loss began to fade, not because it was any less painful, but because Michael had learned how to carry it. He had learned that loss was just another part of life, something that everyone experienced, no matter how successful they were. He had learned that the lessons he had learned from Coach Adams, about resilience, about leadership, about being true to yourself, were the foundation of everything that had come after. Michael's career continued, of course. He remained one of the most iconic athletes the world had ever known, and his influence extended far beyond basketball. But in the years that followed, there was a deeper sense of fulfillment that came from living the values Coach Adams had instilled in him. He gave back to his community, working with young athletes and mentoring the next generation of players. He spoke publicly about the importance of character, of humility, and of leadership, always emphasizing that success on the court was never the full picture of a person's life. He knew that his legacy would live on, not just in the history books or in the countless highlights that would play on television, but in the lives of those he had touched. It was no longer just about being the best player on the court, it was about being the best person he could be, carrying forward the lessons that had been passed on to him by Coach Adams. When he finally retired from the game, Michael looked back at his career with pride, but also with a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had been there for him when it all started. Coach Adams had left an indelible mark on his life, one that would never fade, no matter how many years went by. And so, Michael carried forward, not just as a legend, but as someone who had been shaped by the greatest teacher he had ever known, a teacher who, even in his final days, had given him one last lesson. That true greatness wasn't just about what you achieved, but about the lives you touched along the way. The days that followed Coach Adams' passing felt like a period of transition for Michael. He found himself moving through the motions of his life, but the weight of the loss was never far from his mind. He had always been someone driven by purpose, but now, for the first time, he realized how much of that purpose had been shaped by someone else's influence. The lessons he had learned from Coach Adams, the belief in hard work, the focus on character, the importance of humility, were the principles that had driven him to success, both in basketball and in life. Michael knew he couldn't just bury his grief. He had to face it head-on, as he had faced every other challenge in his career. For him, that meant making the most of what Coach had taught him. It wasn't enough to just carry those lessons forward. Michael wanted to share them with others, to continue Coach Adams' work in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. In the weeks that followed, Michael began to change the way he approached life. Basketball was still a part of him, but it no longer consumed him in the same way it once had. He started focusing more on giving back, something he had always intended to do but had never truly prioritized. He began visiting local schools, speaking to young athletes about the importance of perseverance, discipline, and leadership. He wasn't trying to inspire them with tales of his own success. Instead, he shared Coach Adams' lessons, emphasizing the idea that greatness wasn't just about talent, it was about character. One afternoon, while preparing for one of his speaking engagements, Michael found himself reflecting on the days when he had first come to Coach's gym as a young boy. Back then, he hadn't known what he was capable of. All he had known was that he wanted to play basketball, and Coach Adams had believed in him when no one else had. That belief had become the foundation for everything that came after. Michael thought about how Coach had pushed him beyond his limits, demanding more than he thought he could give. He had always thought of Coach as the source of his drive, but now, Michael realized that the real gift Coach had given him was the belief in himself that he could apply to every aspect of his life. It was this realization that led Michael to his next step, creating a foundation in Coach Adams' name. He knew that he could not only honor his coach's memory but also provide opportunities for kids who came from backgrounds similar to his own. He began working with local organizations to create scholarships, mentorship programs, and sports initiatives that would help young people reach their potential. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about teaching them the same life lessons that Coach had taught him: how to be disciplined, how to persevere in the face of adversity, and how to give back to your community. As the foundation took shape, Michael found that it was no longer just about continuing Coach Adams' legacy, it was about shaping his own. He knew that he couldn't replace his coach, but he could build something that honored the principles Coach had instilled in him. The more he worked on the foundation, the more fulfilled he felt. It gave him a sense of purpose beyond basketball, a sense of connection to a larger community that extended beyond the courts and the arenas. It wasn't easy, of course. Balancing the demands of the foundation with his other commitments was difficult, and there were times when Michael felt overwhelmed by the scope of it all. But he kept going, reminding himself that the work was important, that it mattered not just to the kids he was helping, but to the memory of Coach Adams, who had given so much of himself to help Michael achieve his dreams. One day, as he was sitting in his office, going over some of the foundation's paperwork, Michael received a letter. It was from one of Coach Adams' former players, someone who had been mentored by him during the early years of his coaching career. The letter was simple but powerful. The former player thanked Michael for honoring Coach's memory, and then he shared a story of his own. The player talked about how, much like Michael, he had been unsure of his own abilities when he first started playing. He had been quiet, lacking confidence, but Coach Adams had seen something in him. He had pushed him, encouraged him, and, in the end, helped him believe in himself. The letter ended with a simple sentence that struck Michael deeply: Coach Adams taught us all to be more than just athletes. He taught us how to be men, how to give back, and how to live with integrity. Reading the letter brought everything full circle for Michael. He had spent so much of his life focusing on basketball, on proving himself, on winning titles and accolades. But in the end, what mattered more than anything else was the impact he had on others. He realized that his legacy, his true measure of success, wouldn't come from the number of championships he won or the records he set. It would come from the lives he touched, the people he helped, and the values he passed on to the next generation. Michael stood up from his desk and walked over to the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. His journey had been long, filled with triumphs and setbacks, but now, he understood what it meant to truly live with purpose. He wasn't just Michael Jordan, the basketball legend. He was Michael Jordan, a man who had been shaped by the love and guidance of a coach, and who, in turn, was giving back in ways that would live on long after his playing days were over. He thought about the kids who would benefit from his foundation, the ones who would learn the same lessons he had learned from Coach Adams, about resilience, about leadership, and about the power of giving. In that moment, he knew that the greatest victory he had ever achieved wasn't one that could be measured by stats or trophies. It was the legacy of character, of mentorship, and of community. As he sat back down at his desk, Michael made a promise to himself. He would continue Coach Adams' work for as long as he could. He would ensure that the lessons of his childhood coach lived on, not just through the foundation, but through the countless young people he would inspire, just as Coach had once inspired him. He would never forget the lessons of hard work, perseverance, and humility that had shaped his life. And he would make sure that Coach Adams' legacy, his gift to the world, would continue to inspire generations to come. Michael took a deep breath and smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. His journey had taken many turns, but this was the one that mattered most. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, Michael knew exactly where he was headed. And he knew, without a doubt, that it was the path Coach Adams had always hoped he would take. The next few months were a whirlwind for Michael as he poured more of himself into the foundation. The work he was doing felt different from the basketball court. There were no immediate rewards, no championships to be won. Instead, it was about laying the groundwork for something that would last long after his own playing days. He found himself on planes more often, visiting different communities, meeting young athletes, and speaking with parents and coaches about what the foundation could offer. It was fulfilling, but it also left him feeling drained at times. The responsibilities of the foundation, combined with his desire to make sure it was as impactful as possible, left him with little time to focus on anything else. Despite his busy schedule, Michael had learned to appreciate the quiet moments, moments that allowed him to reconnect with his past. His time in Wilmington was becoming more frequent, and each trip brought him closer to the people who had shaped his early life. He found solace in returning to the gym where Coach Adams had first taught him the game. The familiar courts and the faces of old friends reminded him of the roots he had come from and the values that had shaped him long before he had become a global figure. But even as he worked tirelessly to give back to the community, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He realized that, while he had been honoring Coach Adams' memory through the foundation and through the lessons he was passing on, he had never truly taken the time to mourn. The loss still lingered deep inside him. The quiet moments he spent thinking about Coach were often filled with regret. He hadn't spent enough time with him during the years before his illness, hadn't reached out as often as he should have. He had been consumed by his career, by the demands of being Michael Jordan, and now, Coach was gone, leaving behind a void that no amount of basketball accolades could fill. The guilt was subtle, always in the background, but it was there. Every time he spoke about Coach to others, every time he shared a lesson from the old days, he couldn't escape the thought that he could have done more while Coach was still alive. He had so many questions left unanswered, so many things he had meant to ask, to talk about, but now, it was too late. One day, after finishing a meeting for the foundation, Michael found himself sitting in his office, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts, and when he picked it up, the familiar voice of his brother Larry greeted him. "Mike, I've been thinking about you," Larry said. "How are you holding up?" Michael leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to answer. He had always been the strong one, the one who pushed forward no matter what, but right now, it felt like he was on the verge of breaking. "I'm managing," Michael replied, though his voice didn't sound convincing even to him. "But I can't help but feel like I'm missing something." Like I didn't do enough when it really mattered. Larry paused before responding. Mike, I get it. Losing Coach, it's a big deal. But don't beat yourself up. He knew how much you cared. And you're doing something great with the foundation. You're honoring him in ways that go beyond just talking about him. You're living the lessons he taught you. Michael nodded, even though Larry couldn't see him. I know, but it doesn't feel like enough. Sometimes I feel like I should have been there more. I should have done more while he was still here. Larry's voice softened. You don't need to justify it to anyone, Mike. Not to yourself, and not to him. You've always been a man of action. Maybe it's time to give yourself some credit for that. The conversation ended with Michael feeling a little lighter, but the weight of loss still hung over him. He knew Larry was right, of course. Coach Adams had never expected perfection from him. He had just wanted Michael to be the best version of himself, and Michael had done that in every way he could. Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that there was something missing. As time went on, Michael began to focus more on the community initiatives that the foundation had set in motion. The impact of the work was starting to show. Kids from all over the country were benefiting from the scholarships and mentoring programs. Michael visited schools, spoke at events, and met with families who shared their stories of how the foundation had changed their lives. Every success story made him feel like he was doing the right thing, but it still didn't fill the emptiness left by Coach's passing. Then, one day, as he was preparing for a major event in Chicago, Michael received a letter from a former player of Coach Adams. The letter was from someone who had been coached by Coach many years ago, someone who had moved on to play in college and even the professional ranks. The letter spoke of how Coach Adams had helped shape not only his game but his character. But what struck Michael most about the letter was the line that said, "Coach didn't just teach us how to play basketball, he taught us how to live." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. It was as though the letter had come at the perfect time, when he had been questioning whether the work he was doing was truly enough. The letter was a reminder that Coach Adams' lessons had reached beyond basketball. His impact was far-reaching, touching lives in ways that no title or trophy could. It was in that moment that Michael realized he had been looking at his grief all wrong. He had spent so much time focusing on what he hadn't done, on what he had missed, that he had forgotten to acknowledge everything Coach had given him. It wasn't just the lessons that had been taught in the gym, it was the example Coach had set by how he lived his life. Coach had always put people first, always cared more about character than success, and that was exactly what Michael needed to focus on. The work he was doing with the foundation was exactly what Coach had taught him to do: give back, lead by example, and live with integrity. Michael knew that Coach's legacy didn't live in the past, it lived in the people he had helped, the lives he had shaped, and the way they carried his lessons forward. The foundation wasn't just a tribute to Coach, it was a living, breathing testament to his philosophy. Michael had been doing what Coach had always wanted him to do: lead, not just through his success but through his actions. He sat back in his chair, the letter still in his hands, and for the first time since Coach had passed, he felt a sense of peace. There was no perfect way to honor Coach's memory. No single action could ever be enough. But Michael knew that every moment he spent giving back to others, every life he touched through the foundation, was a way to carry forward the lessons that Coach had instilled in him. As Michael leaned back, thinking about the future, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't need to look back anymore, he just needed to keep moving forward, honoring the past by making a difference in the present. And with that, the emptiness that had once weighed him down began to lift, replaced by the quiet understanding that his journey had only just begun. Months had passed since Michael's epiphany. He had thrown himself into his foundation and, despite the heavy sense of loss that would never fully leave him, found a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation was thriving, scholarships, mentorships, sports programs, and community outreach initiatives were making tangible differences in the lives of young people across the country. Michael had visited countless cities, met with children, families, coaches, and community leaders, always sharing the lessons that had been instilled in him by Coach Adams. It felt different from basketball. The recognition wasn't immediate. The success was more measured, slower. There was no scoreboard to tell him how well he was doing, no press conference to highlight his achievements. But there was something that felt more rewarding. Every thank you from a parent, every smile from a kid who realized their dreams were now attainable, reminded Michael why he had started all of this. Still, every so often, the grief crept back in. The absence of Coach Adams was a constant in the back of his mind. Michael found that his most reflective moments often occurred when he was alone in the quiet of his home or driving through Wilmington. Those memories of the old gym, the long conversations, and the shared laughter felt distant but close at the same time. He had been given so much by Coach. It wasn't just the fundamentals of basketball, it was the way to approach life, how to stay grounded, how to keep moving forward, even in the face of difficulty. In the months since Coach's passing, Michael had become more involved in personal projects. He had taken up mentoring a few young athletes on his own. It wasn't part of any official program, he just found himself connecting with kids who reminded him of his younger self, the ones who didn't believe they had what it took but were hungry for success nonetheless. One of those kids, a young high school athlete named Isaiah, had particularly caught Michael's attention. Isaiah was a natural talent but lacked confidence. He had the physical tools, but it was his mental game that needed work. Michael had been guiding him through the mental side of the game, pushing him to believe in himself, just as Coach Adams had done for him. And while Michael had always focused on basketball, what he learned from working with Isaiah was just how much those lessons translated into life outside the game. The lessons Coach had taught Michael weren't just about how to make a basket or win a game, they were about how to live a full life, how to take losses as they came, and how to lead others by example. It was clear to Michael now that he was doing exactly what Coach had wanted him to do all along. But it wasn't just the foundation or mentoring that had brought a sense of healing. It was his growing understanding of what Coach had wanted for him, and for all the others he had mentored. Coach had wanted Michael to be a man who lived with integrity, who gave back to others, and who never lost sight of the things that mattered most. As the months wore on, Michael continued to honor Coach's legacy in his actions. He stayed involved in the foundation, ensuring that it not only flourished but that it stayed true to the ideals Coach had lived by. But Michael's biggest breakthrough came one quiet evening when he was sitting alone in his office, reviewing foundation reports. He had been busy, but as he sat back, he realized something. It had been a while since he had allowed himself the space to reflect on what Coach had meant to him, not just as a coach, but as a man who had helped shape his worldview. In a way, Michael had been so focused on action, on doing things for others, that he hadn't allowed himself the time to truly understand what Coach's death had meant to him. The quiet realization hit him then: his Coach's legacy didn't only live in the work he did with young athletes or in the programs he created. It lived in Michael, in the person he had become, and how he treated others, and how he now looked at life beyond basketball. A few weeks later, Michael returned to Wilmington. The trip wasn't for a speaking engagement or a visit to the foundation. It was personal. It was a time for him to reconnect with the place that had shaped him and, in a way, reconnect with his past. He stood in front of the old gym, the one Coach had worked in for so many years, where Michael had learned some of the most important lessons of his life. The gym had been remodeled since the days when he played there, but it still had the same spirit. The same energy. Michael stood outside, taking a deep breath, before stepping through the doors. The smell of old wood and polished floors hit him immediately. The gym hadn't changed, not really. It was still the same place where he had first picked up a basketball and had dreams of being great. Inside, a few local kids were practicing, shooting hoops, laughing, just like Michael had done all those years ago. He stood at the edge of the court, watching them with a smile. The kids were full of energy, full of potential, and Michael saw in them a reflection of his own younger self. It was then that it hit him: Coach's lessons weren't just for the athletes. They were for the people who took them in. The ones who mentored and led. Coach Adams had never just been a teacher of the game, he was a teacher of life. He had seen potential in people, had believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves, and had helped them see what they were capable of. The kids in the gym didn't know who Michael was. They didn't know his history or his name. But as he stood there, watching them play, he felt a deep connection to that moment. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And it wasn't just because of the games he had won or the records he had set, it was because of the lessons that had been passed down to him. It was because he was living the values Coach Adams had taught him all those years ago. He had become someone who helped others, who believed in the potential of others, just as Coach had done for him. As he walked out of the gym, Michael felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. The void left by Coach's death would never be filled, but he didn't need it to be. He had learned, through time and reflection, that Coach's presence wasn't bound by physical space. It was in every decision Michael made, and every life he touched, and every lesson he shared. The road had not been easy. The grief had been hard to navigate, but through it, Michael had found his true purpose. The work, the mentoring, the lessons, all of it had come full circle. And as he looked back at the gym one last time, he knew that the legacy of Coach Adams would live on in every person Michael helped and every young athlete who walked the same path he had walked so many years ago. Michael's journey, it seemed, was far from over. It had only just begun.